here. I'm Brent Gloy, and I apologize. The sun is coming through my window pretty bright this morning, kind of reflecting off and reminding me that I don't have much hair left here this morning. But it's about 7:30 here in the Mountain Time Zone where I'm at, and getting ready for another scorching hot day out here. We've been over 100 here for a while, and it's. I hope you're staying. It's hard to believe it, but we're already to the point where we need to really start thinking about preparing for 2024. And I don't know about you, but if you're like me, it just feels like these dates are just ripping through the calendar faster and faster as you go. I guess that's a sign of my age. But we do want to talk about getting ready for 2024 because there's a lot of things that we need to do here. We're going to be really busy with harvest very soon, and but it's not a time to fall asleep on getting ready for 2024. So we want to talk about that today. One of the things that we like to do, David and I like to do, is take advantage of frameworks that people have developed to help us think about the world. And one of them that we have found very useful is something called the OODA loop. And the OODA loop was developed by John Boyd, who is a Force colonel and military strategist, and I believe it was in the Korean War. He never wrote a book on this or anything, but what he did is during the Korean War, he tried to study, why were some pilots more successful than others, and what was determining who was winning dogfights in the air. And he came up with this idea that the pilots who could go through what he called the OODA loop faster and more efficiently than others tended to be more successful. And the OODA loop is something that's pretty simple. We start by observing the environment, just kind of get the lay of the land. What's the situation we're in? Then orienting ourselves to that environment. So take a minute or a second to kind of figure out, okay, here's what the environment is, here's how we're sitting, and what are the decisions that are in front of us that we have to make? Then make a decision and act on it. And David and I talk about this a lot because I found this to be very useful even in my own decision making because I'm very good at observing the environment. That's what David and I do. We assess the economic situation in agriculture. We write about it, we describe it, we kind of observe it. And we try and help people orient themselves to that environment. But where I get stuck a lot of times is that making a decision, okay? And I always tell David, well, I'm going to pocket veto this. And what does that mean? It means that I'm going to let that decision lie on my desk until the decision is made for me. And in politics, the pocket veto can be kind of useful because the president takes that bill and he sets it aside and it dies for lack of him acting. He doesn't have to actually veto it. But in decision making, that's not a very good strategy sometimes. Sometimes it is good to wait, but too often we rely on that to kind of let the decision make itself, and that's not a good way to do it. And then act on that decision. So observe the situation, orient yourselves, make a decision, and act on that decision. That is the OODA loop. So what we want to do is kind of walk through that process today in our webinar. So we'll start by kind of taking a sense for the farm economy and observing what's going on. Now, as I think everybody is aware, there have been some pretty big changes, particularly in the corn market, where we've seen prices drop, a dollar plus from their highs earlier in the year. So we have lost a significant amount of price activity in the corn market as the market has struggled to kind of assess where the crop is at and what it is. Soybeans, on the other hand, have not seen as rapid a deterioration, in part because the soybean crop is usually made later. The soybean situation is a lot tighter, considerably tighter than the corn situation. So when we observe the farm economy, the profit potential or the revenue potential that we once saw is diminished now relative to what it was earlier. Oh, David, I think maybe were you going to do the balance sheets or do you want me to do them? I
Yep, I'm
forgot.
jumping in here, Brent. I think
Sorry about that.
no, we wanted to
I'll
help
just keep talking.
wanted to provide a little bit of background as to what's going on in that situation and those the roller coaster and all of the volatility that we've seen in these commodity markets. And it's kind of hard to for producers to potentially respond to all this changing information. So we want to provide that base level of where are we today as you get into harvest to help you think through that. So here's the balance sheet that the WASI report came out with in August. Projected a 15.3% stocks to use ratio for corn. And that's starting to get to that burdensome end of the pendulum swing because the long run average is right around 13%. For context, we were at 10% last year and 9% the year earlier. So what we're sitting here is there's a lot of different narratives here in this corn story, and part of that roller coaster we saw in the prices. First, we were worried about the weather, and then we had all these acres come into play, and then we saw another weather concern. And where we're at here is about 175.1 bushel. Now, that is a pretty big yield hit considering we were starting at over 181 bushels back in May. So we've seen yields clipped back quite a bit. But again, it's this acreage story that's been looming over the balance sheets. Other thing to keep in mind here is this total usage. 2 years ago, we used nearly 15 billion bushels of corn. Last year, or the marketing year we're closing out now, the crop we harvested a year ago at 13.7 billion bushels. So that's kind of the high water mark and this lower water mark where we had a lot of rationing or a lot of users cutting back based on the prices. A big uncertainty for this upcoming marketing year is how many bushels will we use? Is it USDA is kind of in the middle here at 14.4 billion bushels. So we're gaining some of this usage back, but we're not nearly as far up as where we would like to be. So we have this 2.2 billion bushel carry out. Again, it's we're not tight in stocks here for corn at any stretch of the imagination at this point. But as we see the USDA's yield estimates, and there's still a lot of variability where these yield estimates, or history would tell us there could still be a lot of movement in these yield estimates, at both to the upside and the downside as we move through the fall. And then, of course, we got to watch usage, and I think usage is going to be a really key development there. Now, as we move to the soybean side, as you all are probably familiar, we have a very opposite story. So corn's a bit burdensome. Soybeans are on the tighter side. So we have this unbalanced situation for our primary crops. We have soybean ending stocks in August estimated at 5.8%. For context, 8.2% is the long run average. And in fact, 5.8% would be tighter than anything we've seen in the last 2 years. We have yields that have came down a little bit. We've had acreage that came down from the initial projections back in May. What's really interesting here and worth keeping in mind is ending stocks at 245 million bushels is really low. It's the lowest that we've seen in an absolute bushel standpoint. And of course, we see usage falling as well. So the lowest usage of the last 3 years in response to these really tight stocks. And that we should expect that. We should expect these prices to be pulling back on usage to, again, ration those beans that we have in the pipeline to make sure we maintain those adequate stocks. So again, we're going to keep an eye and make sure we get those beans exported. Domestic crush and all of this renewable diesel energy or renewable energy enthusiasm will still be a part of those markets as we move forward. So again, this is another part of this observing that you want to keep in mind as the USDA begins to make yield adjustments on soybeans, and they could go both directions. You're going to see this usage have to cut back if we see a yield hit because of this tight stock situation. The other development I think is really worth keeping an eye on is fertilizer prices, and we put the scripture "watch out" below. A few weeks ago we were monitoring these, and the prices fell quite a bit from the spring, and then as you can see, just in the last 10 days to 2 weeks, prices across for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium has fallen really quickly. Now, they're still historically high. They're still way higher than what we saw before the pandemic, that 2016 to 2019, early 2020 range. But we saw a really quick change. So as you prepare for 2024, thinking about corn versus soybeans, when do you buy fertilizer? You're going to see a big fertilizer price difference. I think one of the elements here do you want to keep in mind is as you're calling around and getting prices. Retailers are going to be struggling in this environment because they're going to struggling to get a price. They're not going to want to take on a lot of inventory themselves because the market's been volatile a while. So it's going to maybe take you some time to get those supplies lined up just because of all of the risk that the supply chain is looking at when it comes to price volatility. So maybe plan a little bit more time as you think about pricing your fertilizer heading into next year.
And David, so I think that's a good setup. So we've kind of observed what the environment is. I mean, probably a much lower um, potential price outlook for 2024 and the end of 2023 than we've been looking at for a while. And then but fortunately things like fertilizer prices starting to adjust downward. So once we've observed that situation, let's try and orient ourselves and figure out where we're at in that situation. So we want to put all these pieces together. And the first thing to do is get a really good update of your 2023 financial performance. Get that budget out and compare it to what you're actually doing. We put that budget together um, last winter, and I think it's quite useful sometimes to pull that budget up and just see where you're at running at compared to what you had projected. Try and get a sense of why you might be doing better or worse than you planned. And now is the time where we can really start to get updated yield and price estimates for this fall crop. So, you know, estimating yield, I find, at least on my farm, to be quite tough until about this time. Once, here in another couple of weeks, we will be, you'll be able to go out there and have a pretty good idea of what you're dealing with. And I think that's a good thing to kind of sit down and orient yourself to look at your financial performance. Sit down with your financial services officer, go over that information and kind of get a plan for the next few months because they're going to go fast and that you're going to get really, really busy. And then we want to start thinking about budgeting for 2024. And, when will we make that? Well, like I said, we get really busy, but it's never a bad time to start thinking about it. I know some of us are probably getting fertilizer pricing for next year already. That's a big component. You'll have your seed pricing very soon if you haven't already, another huge component. And cash rents are going to be starting to get locked in here pretty soon. So it's time to start thinking about that budget and making that projection for what the next year might look like. Now, when David and I do that, we put budgets together for a bunch of different regions around the country. And we've already done that for corn in, say, the Heartland region, which I think would cover a lot of the growing area in your association. Um, and if not, the trends are the numbers might be a little bit different, but the trends are pretty close. And what we've got here is the economic cost of producing corn on your left and soybeans on your right, and we have it over time. And the blue bars are our estimate of the total cost of production. Now, that total cost estimate includes pretty much all of the cost of production. That's a full economic cost. It's not a cash flow cost. It doesn't include principal payments or anything like that, but it includes what we consider to be most of all of the economic costs. So that's what we consider to be a fully loaded cost. And as you can see, our number, and then the black triangles, let me explain those as well. Those are corn prices and soybean prices based upon what the futures market is telling us for the next year. And so we take, a kind of a composite of all of those future prices that come up with um, one number. And what you can see is that the blue bars, at least in corn production, have been falling since 2022. We saw, we projected a slight decline in 2023, and we are projecting another decline in 2024, being driven largely by fertilizer prices coming down. David is, really into these numbers, so he can help explain any of those if you have questions. But we're projecting to see some cost improvement. Unfortunately, the futures market is telling us that the prices won't be quite as good in 2023. But the good news is that there is still a slight wedge between our budgeted total costs and prices. So that would tell us that this is setting up to be, not as good a year probably as we may have had the past few, where you look at a year like 2021, low cost, really high price, pretty high prices, a lot of economic profitability. Same in 2022. 23 probably be pretty good year. And 2024 looks again to be a decent year, even though those prices have declined. On the soybean side, we didn't see quite as much of a decline in the cost of production. Fertilizer not as big a component of those costs, but some improvement in the prices from 2023. The other cost that's changed quite a bit for us is interest rates, and we get a lot of questions about interest rates. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it. We know that the interest rate on the line of credit, for instance, is up significantly from what it was just a few years ago. When we look at the data, we put together a farm machinery debt service index, and what that is what the annual payment is to service $1,000 worth of debt. And you can see that index has not risen much, even with these higher interest. What's driving that? Well, if we look at farm machinery interest expense, it's up substantially. So what has been driving that is an extension of payment terms. So what people have tended to be doing is extending their payment terms, payment length, out to longer terms to keep that debt service index down. Uh, we know the interest expenses are shooting up quite rapidly, and something to keep an eye on in your own operation and not fall asleep on, thinking that our debt service hasn't really gotten worse. Well, partly because we've been extending term, and we want to pay attention to that interest expense going forward, because it's starting to get up there where it's taken a bite.
So Brent, we've walked through Observe, we've walked through Orient, and we're going to spend time now. We're going to talk briefly about deciding an active. We're going to bring our lender expert on here in just a couple minutes. But one of the things that we can do to help improve our decision-making process is to think about a decision checklist. And checklists, coincidentally, also come from the aviation world. And one of the things about a checklist is you start to think about what comes ahead, and you can make better decisions than just reacting in the environment. So thinking about the decisions you face in the next 5-6 months, we recommend a checklist. Step back and just make a list. Identify all the big decisions that you typically make between now and the first of the year. And then once you do that, and I think it's really important, you start with a blank sheet of paper or a blank Word document and just brainstorm a little bit, all these types of decisions that you might be making. And then when you step back and reflect on that list, you're going to start to notice maybe three different categories. And these are the three categories that we recommend, but you might have a different set of categorization. But the idea here is first prioritize. What are the 3 to 5 most important decisions. Your decision list is probably going to be really big. It can be as specific as, what am I going to set the concave setting on for my soybean harvest this year based on the dry conditions. That could be one of those decisions. But step back and say, what are those 3 to 5 most important that I have to tackle this fall and early winter? And that's going to be it's going to help you determine which ones am I going to sharpen my pencil on, and which one am I going to really focus a lot of effort and attention. Maybe those rainy days, I'm going to commit to working on those. And once you identify those priorities, you can start considering what information or advice might be missing. You can start now, maybe scheduling conversations with your financial officer or scheduling a phone call with your fertilizer provider, or maybe get asking about those seed prices. So you can start initiating those conversations by thinking about the pieces of information that are missing and pulling those into your OODA loop. The second category here are maybe autopilot decisions. Maybe these are decisions that you largely put on repeat from year to year. The challenge with these, or the opportunities with these, is you can start thinking about how can I minimize my bandwidth. Sometimes if we are just reacting as the whack-a-mole, as the problem comes up, we might find ourselves spending a whole lot of time making a decision that in reality, if we stopped and think about it, we say, well, what did I do last year and how do I repeat that? Maybe it's buying lubricant or maybe grease or maybe shop supplies as you head through the end of the year. Do you need to spend a whole lot of time thinking about that, or can you just go get last year's order and make some tweaks, or just largely autopilot do that? And I think the next category here is really important as well. This is the watch list. Maybe these are 3 to 5 decisions that could change. So you identify what is your initial decision, what conditions would cause you to change that initial decision. Maybe it's prices or the timing of when information becomes available. And then think about what are the alternatives and constraints. And the idea with this watch list is these are the ones that you have an initial assumption, but you're just not ready to maybe commit. Maybe you're still, maybe practicing that pocket veto, or you think about practicing that pocket veto. But the idea is let's prime the pump as much as we can. Let's get a base decision in there, and let's start thinking about how you would deviate, what conditions would cause you to deviate that. And when you do deviate, where are you going to deviate towards? So prioritize, autopilot, watch list. These are just 3 ways that you can categorize that decision list. But again, making that decision list is going to really set you ahead, because you're already going to be thinking about how you can speed up that OODA loop. And Brent, I'm going to have you wrap us up here before we bring in Kyle to answer some questions that talk about the ACT part of the OODA loop.
Yeah, I think this is ultimately, the most important thing. And a smart CEO once told me, the good managers figure out how to make their actions or their decisions work. And getting into that problem, the actual, okay, we've got a decision made, let's act on it, let's go forward. I think there are also things we can start to think about. Can we delegate some things or outsource some activities on our operation? Those are things we need to consider. And then I would say, review how your process has gone. I really encourage you to think about this OODA loop process. I use it a lot myself. I'm always thinking about what has changed in the environment and how has that positioned me today, and what decisions does that, impact. And so, go ahead and put that concept in your toolbox and start thinking about using it. I find it quite useful. And always, review what did I do well last year, what didn't go so well, and how can we improve? And that, I think, ultimately is the way we all get better from year to year, is sitting down and doing that review process of, hey, what went really well this year, and hey, what do we really not want to do again, and what can we do to put ourselves in a situation where we're not, redoing the mistakes of the past. So I think, David, we're at our time, and we should bring in Kyle and get him on here and get some insights from him. You're on mute, David.
Well, thank you for that, Brent. Kyle, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for helping us prepare. I want to get this kicked off by having you tell us a little about yourself and your role with Mid-America.
Yeah, just like Micah mentioned, senior financial officer here at Farm Credit Mid-America. Been going on 10 years or so at the company, in banking, about 15 my entire career, basically. Also operate a small grain farm in Northwest Ohio, which is also, like I said, where I'm working on a farm credit here. A small town called Archbold is where I work, but I'm from a Defiance County, which is tucked up right in the northwest corner of Ohio. So.
Well, thank you for that, Kyle. I'm curious, from your lender lens or from your seat as a lender, what are some of the biggest decisions that you see producers typically making between August and December? And I think this is maybe the ideas that you share could be a great starting point for producers as they make their own checklist.
Yeah, just like I discussed on this webinar, I would say a lot of guys this time of year. I know my seed guy just called me yesterday, I believe. But starting to price inputs, fertilizer, seed are usually seem to be the first couple that people start looking at, and next, usually chemicals after that, kind of towards the end of the year. It seems to be all seem to be favorable right now as far as price goes. I think seeds, I'm sure, is probably holding steady, but I know fertilizer and chemicals are both seem to be on the downtrend, like we talked about earlier. And then also, guys are starting to do some tax planning, which kind of goes hand in hand with the inputs as far as how much do you need to prepay? Does it make sense to prepay? Is there any capital expenditures that maybe have to happen by the end of the year to, kind of kick the can on the taxes? So, equipment's a little bit easier to get your hands on right now than it was there for a couple of years, but still pretty scarce. I know a lot of guys in our area have been investing in storage, things like that too. So maybe looking at making some purchases there for use of next year. And then the last thing guys are usually calling us about is, hey, where does it make sense to maybe reduce some debt? What loans would make sense to pay off right now, especially with the rate environment we're in. It's not as easy as it used to be. Kind of got to weigh the pros and cons on which loans you have at what rates. So those are the three primary things that you guys are focusing on this time of year.
So now thinking about this from the other side, what are some of the factors or conditions that are making the 2023 situation so different when it comes to decision making? And so I guess building off that also is, are there some caution that producers should use when they're exercising maybe that autopilot decision making approach that we talked about?
Yeah, so obviously a big thing that everyone's well aware of, rates are up significantly, even from 12 months, 18 months ago, really high, 12 months ago, still up. So, if you're just in the normal autopilot, you pay for your seed this time of year, just write the check. I think at this point, you might need to actually put a pencil to it to make sure it makes sense to prepay it, as early as you have been in the past. Maybe you wait till December potentially, or even the first of the year if you don't need the write-off. You just, before when operating lines were 3-4%, it was a no-brainer. Now that they're, double that, you definitely got to put a pencil to it, make sure it makes sense. Same with selling grain. I mean, obviously last year, I would say most guys would have been better off probably selling it out of the field than holding it between the storage cost and rates. Obviously, who knows if this year is going to be the same. It looks like there is maybe a slightly better carry in the market at the moment, but things like that, like guys are just used to always putting everything on DP. You might want to say, hey, if I can just get my operating line paid to zero, maybe I'll be just as good off with the current rate. So things that I would say traditionally people haven't really focused on that. And then yeah, just kind of what to do with the working capital. Now we're going to get into that here in a second, but basically, is debt reduction the best option? If you do have some extra working capital, if you've already pretty much paid for all your expenses, things like that. So there's some different tools in Farm Credit's toolbox. We have the disbursement card for if you do use your operating line, you can get like 1.5% back. So there's some different tools to keep those costs down, even if you are prepaying for those expenses here sooner than later. So
last question I have for you, and of course we're gonna kick it back to Micah after this, and we're gonna open it up to all the Q&A coming in from the audience. But we're reviewing this, and it doesn't look like 2023 and even 2024 is going to be as profitable as we saw the last 2 years, but it's still a positive or favorable economic outlook. What suggestions do you have for producers as we think about still deploying those profits and still growing the business and making progress towards our long-term goals as we wrap up this year and start making plans for 24?
Yeah, so one of the big discussions Farm Credit always has with their customers is kind of maintaining what we call working capital. So in the past, there hasn't been a whole lot of advantage to keep working capital just because there was no real way to invest that besides, paying for inputs or maybe buying a tractor or something. But the way the rate environment has gone right now is a good time, especially with the farm economy. Having 2, 3 good years in a row here, you typically are going to see a downturn. So we definitely advising guys to hold on to some of that cash if they can. And there's actually some places to put it for the first time in probably my honestly banking career. So like for instance, we have a money market account that's paying almost 4% right now, and I have a lot of producers that have 20-year fixed rates that are at or below that. So it used to always be you just pay off some debt if you had some extra money or go buy a piece of equipment or something, but just investing that and getting some return right now to kind of weather a potential storm is something we're definitely advising our producers to do. And then also, maybe invested in something else. I know we talked about, most farmers don't have big 401k plans, but maybe throw a little money in some kind of IRA or something if you want to, or obviously a lot of farmers like to put money in land as well, which we all know those prices are continue to go up, which hopefully continues. But if not, there are some other places to kind of hold that working capital, invest it, and like I said, kind of prepare for potentially tighter margins here in the next couple of years, the way it's looking to shake out right now. So those would be our main advice to our producers right now.
Well, great. Thank you so much for that, Kyle. I look forward to having you stick around to answer some of the audience questions. But at this point, Micah, we're at the 30-minute mark, so I'm going to kick it back to you to help us wrap up and sort through the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you both. We appreciate it. We are going to continue on with some Q&A here. As a reminder for all participants, this is being recorded and we will send it out following the webinar. So if you aren't able to stick around, no worries. We will have a recorded version for you in your inbox here within the next week. One of the questions that came in, and you've already alluded to it, Kyle, was really about the servicing debt versus the opportunity cost. We're kind of in this unique environment right now where it might be more advantageous to leave some debt on the books and put your money elsewhere into savings or into working capital. Any thoughts on that beyond what you've said so far as to maybe what that process can look like for customers as they're trying to make that decision?
Yeah, like I said, kind of just reiterating what I said, but yeah, I mean, we're definitely in a unique situation, the most unique in my career, as far as, like I said, retiring debt might not be your best place to put that extra cash right now. Just with, keeping that operating line maybe close to zero if you can. And like I said, actually being able to invest it and get a better return than retiring the debt. So, I think it's really a good opportunity for our producers to potentially go into a tighter margin, a few years here with a significant amount of working capital that we historically really haven't had the chance to do. Or, like I said, you're getting next to nothing on your savings for the last 15 years pretty much. So I think guys are really poised to potential if things do continue to maybe slide a little bit to really be in a good shape going into it. So
I think that's a really good point, Kyle. And it is really unique, isn't it? I mean, this doesn't happen very often. And this higher interest rate environment is causing, as you said, I thought it was a really good point. It impacts a whole bunch of decisions, especially even like prepaying. I mean, when you had, money in the bank that was earning 0.02% or something, almost charging you to hold it for you, it changes your decision making process compared to what it is today, where you can, put it even at farm credit and earn a very good rate of return on those balances. So I think that's it's something everybody needs to get oriented to, that environment. It's different than it has been, and it's worth paying attention to. And I think the other one you brought up was grain, holding the grain. Again, the costs of carrying that, of storing that grain, when you can earn a decent rate of return on the money that you get from selling your grain is real, and it adds to what it's costing you to store that crop.
I'll jump in and add one more element to this interest rate environment that's unique to our careers. Is not only did we have a decade of really low interest rates and before that declining interest rates, but the last, I guess, before 2022, interest rates were really stable. They were near zero and they didn't move a lot. And we've
Yeah.
seen 500 basis points of movement coming out of the Federal Reserve. So I don't know what the future has in store. But I think we need to also think about how are we issuing new debt and think about the retiring debt, issuing new debt. What are our goals and how might we be using debt in the future? We also have to add in this uncertainty and this variability, this volatility that could be is we don't know what the interest rate market could be in 12 or 18 months. And so it's kind of this bird in the hand versus two in the bush idea. I wouldn't want to build a business model assuming that interest rates are going to be considerably lower in the future because we just don't know what that future might have. So thinking about that will be important as well.
I have a question here that might challenge you all, but I'm going to ask for just a quick response, gut reaction. The question is around financial forecast and the future of the economy. Positive, proceed cautiously, or maybe a little bit negative on what we could be expecting here in the next 12 to 24 months. David?
I made you go first.
Well, I'll tell you what Brent was going to say. He's going to say avoid being complacent. And the idea here is I think there's a lot of reasons why to be concerned, and there's a few reasons to be optimistic. I think in general, the economy has been doing well. We have inflation coming down. We have unemployment staying low. I think that is a positive development. But there are some storm clouds. There's a lot of uncertainty. So don't don't get complacent in this environment and be ready to build a plan that works.
Dr. Gloy, did he take yours?
Well, I think that's pretty good. And what I would say is I have been saying, I mean, last year, a little bit later than this, I had been saying, I thought the chance of us having a recession and probably a pretty deep recession in the United States were very high, and just been wrong. It hasn't happened. And I don't think that means it won't necessarily happen in the future, but the economy has been much more resilient than I think a lot of us thought. And so, yeah, it's surprised me. The other thing that I think a lot of people, the situation in China is, it's the same thing. They've got a lot of issues over there, and as David and I were talking yesterday, all commodity markets run. China is so important to all of the commodity markets. Whether even when they're not buying our commodities, they're buying everybody else's, and it really drives the world markets. And so it's something to really keep an eye on what's going over there. So I would say, cautiously optimistic to positively pessimistic or something. I don't know. I I'm a little concerned about what the economy is going to do, but at the end of the day, I think most of the decisions we make on our farms, we can't be paralyzed by that. We have to do what's best for our operation and move forward, and I think we can all do that.
I don't want to make a farm credit employee speculate, Kyle, but do you have an opinion you'd like to share? Or do you
I
want
mean,
to just
I
leave it
would
to those
say
two economists?
cautiously optimistic. I mean, locally, rural America seems like the economy is, I don't see positive. I mean, we haven't seen any kind of downturn in our little small town America, I guess. But, we don't have some of those big tech jobs and stuff either that have been slashed, that you hear about in these bigger cities. So, sometimes it takes a little while to trickle down to rural America here, but I would say positive to optimistic. I mean, as far as the farm economy goes, I'd definitely be cautious, but I mean, our unemployment rate still, 3% or whatever. It's just kind of crazy. Like you said, it's amazing how resilient it's been. So.
One of the things that we often talk about at our farms class, our financial and risk management seminar, is about utilizing Farm Credit Mid-America team members as a resource and a tool for you. So as you kind of hear what the gentleman talked about today, we want you to give your financial officer a call as you get into that combine cab, and we want you to be able to start to ask about or gut check where you were at the end of 23 and where you plan to go in 2024. Utilize some of the ideas that were shared with y'all today, but call your FO and have them come out to the farm and have them start to run those scenarios so that you have somebody to kind of talk through these unique times with and just have a sounding board, if nothing else. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that topic here in November as we head into our Q4 webinar with AEI. And so we hope that you'll kind of keep an eye out for that event. And also in the meantime, have a safe and happy harvest, and lean on your farm credit team as you have these conversations on your operation. And we hope that we can be of service to you. And so with that, thank you, gentlemen, for your time today. This recording will be sent out via email later this week, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.